Black waitress fired for serving. Donald Trump. What happened next will shock you. The dinner rush had just begun, and the smell of sizzling steak and freshly baked bread filled the air. The sound of clinking silverware mixed with the low hum of conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner booth. The energy inside Jackson's diner was as lively as ever, a familiar scene for Keisha Brown, who had worked here for the past 5 years. To the regulars, she wasn't just a waitress, she was family. She knew who liked their coffee with 2 sugars and who wanted extra gravy on their mashed potatoes before they even asked. Keisha had seen all kinds of customers come through the doors, businessmen in tailored suits, construction workers fresh off their shifts, tourists looking for an authentic American meal. She'd even served a couple of celebrities here and there, but tonight was about to be different. The front door swung open, and immediately the chatter inside the diner dropped. People turned their heads, eyes widening. A woman gasped audibly, covering her mouth as she elbowed the man next to her. Standing in the doorway, with his unmistakable presence, was none other than Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States, and now, once again, the leader of the free world. He was flanked by 2 Secret Service agents, their sharp eyes scanning the room. Trump's signature golden hair was neatly combed back, and he wore a dark suit, though his red tie hung slightly loose, as if he had just come from a long day of meetings. The energy in the diner changed in an instant. Some people whispered in hushed excitement. Others pulled out their phones, snapping quick pictures. A man near the counter muttered, "No way," as he nudged his friend. Keisha felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just any customer. This was the most powerful man in the country. Still, a customer was a customer. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and was about to step forward when a firm hand gripped her wrist. "Not you," a voice hissed. She turned, startled, to find Robert Whitmore, the diner's owner and manager, standing beside her. His expression was tense, but his fake smile was plastered in place. "I'll have Michael serve him," Robert whispered. Keisha frowned, confused. "Michael's in the back on dish duty. I'm next in rotation." Robert shook his head. "I need someone more suitable." Keisha's stomach sank. She had worked here long enough to recognize what he was really saying. She folded her arms, keeping her voice steady. "And what exactly makes me not suitable, Robert?" Robert glanced at Trump's table, then back at her, his jaw tightening. "Look, I don't need any problems tonight. I just think it would be better for everyone if someone else took the table." She let out a humorless laugh. "You mean someone white?" Robert's face turned red. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," she shot back. A sharp silence passed between them. Keisha had dealt with a lot in her life. Growing up, she had learned to navigate a world where people sometimes looked at her and made up their minds before she even spoke. But she had never let it define her. And she wasn't about to start now. She took a step forward, refusing to back down. "I do my job, and I do it well. He came here to eat. I came here to serve. That's it." Robert's grip on her wrist tightened. "You're not hearing me. I own this place, and I say Michael is serving him." Keisha ripped her arm free, her pulse pounding. "And I say no." Before Robert could react, she grabbed a menu, turned on her heel, and marched toward the most powerful man in the country. Keisha approached the table with steady hands, her grip firm around the menu. She refused to let Robert's words shake her. At the end of the day, Donald Trump was just another customer. A high-profile one, sure, but he still had to eat like everyone else. Trump was scrolling through his phone, his fingers moving over the screen with practiced ease. The 2 Secret Service agents stood close, their eyes sweeping the room, their expressions unreadable. Keisha had served celebrities before, but never anyone with this level of security. She stopped just short of the table, standing tall. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Jackson's Diner. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Trump looked up from his phone, his blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, there was silence. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe. Like he knew something had just happened before she got there. He glanced around the diner, as if taking in the reaction of the other customers, then gave her a small nod. "I'll have a Diet Coke." Keisha smiled professionally. "Absolutely. And to eat?" He set his phone down, leaning back slightly. "You guys do steak?" "We do." "Well done," he said, without hesitation. "Extra ketchup?" Keisha smirked. "Of course. Anything else?" "That'll do it." He studied her for a second longer. "You've worked here long?" 5 years. He nodded again, like he was filing that information away for later. "Good." Keisha wasn't sure what to make of that response, but she gave him a polite nod before turning toward the kitchen. As she walked away, she could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. Conversations had resumed, but hushed and cautious, as if people were waiting to see what happened next. Behind the counter, she grabbed a glass, filled it with ice, and poured the Diet Coke. As she placed it on the tray, she noticed Robert standing near the kitchen doors, his arms crossed, his face red with barely contained anger. The moment she got within arm's reach, he grabbed her elbow, forcing her to stop. "I told you not to go over there," he hissed. Keisha yanked her arm free. "And I told you I'm doing my job." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not anymore." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. For a second, she thought she had misheard. "Excuse me." "You're fired," he said, his voice just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The diner went dead silent. Keisha could feel the eyes on her, the way customers froze mid-bite, the way the waitstaff exchanged nervous glances. A cold chill crawled up her spine, but she refused to let him see her break. "You're firing me," she repeated, her voice steady. "For taking an order?" Robert's jaw tightened. "I told you to let Michael handle it. You went against my decision." Keisha let out a sharp laugh, disbelief mixing with anger. "You mean I went against your racism?" The words cut through the room like a blade. A few customers murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. But Keisha wasn't backing down. Not now. And then, before Robert could respond, another voice cut through the silence. "She's what?" It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. A voice that made people turn their heads. Donald Trump was staring directly at Robert, his expression unreadable. His hand was resting on the table, fingers drumming lightly against the surface. His Diet Coke sat untouched. Robert swallowed hard, his confidence faltering. Mr. President, Trump tilted his head. "You just fired her. In front of me." Robert's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. It's a personnel issue, sir. Not anything to—" Trump raised a hand, cutting him off. No, I think it is something. Because I just watched that whole thing." His gaze flicked to Keisha. "You've worked here how long?" 5 years, she said, her voice firm. He nodded slowly. 5 years. And he's firing you over this? His eyes shifted back to Robert, his expression hardening. That doesn't sit right with me. Robert's face was turning redder by the second. Sir, with all due respect, I run this business the way I see fit. Trump smirked. Oh yeah? Well, I run a couple of businesses myself. Let me give you some advice. You don't fire good employees over nonsense, especially not over this kind of nonsense. Robert's lips twitched, but he didn't say anything. The entire diner was watching, waiting, holding their breath. Trump leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something, Robert. If she was white, would she still have a job right now?" Robert's face twisted. "That's not—" "It is the question," Trump cut in smoothly. "Because I know the answer. Everyone in here knows the answer. You just don't want to say it." Keisha's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. She had expected Trump to ignore it, or worse, brush it off. But now, he was sitting there, calling Robert out in front of the entire diner. Trump exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but I hate one thing above all else." He pointed a finger at Robert. "Cowards." Robert's eyes widened slightly. "Sadash." "I'm talking." Trump straightened. "This woman came to work, did her job, and you fired her while she was serving me. That's bad business, that's bad character, and it's just plain stupid." Robert was now visibly sweating. Trump gestured toward the kitchen. "So here's the deal. You're gonna rehire her, with a raise, or I'll make sure everyone hears about this. And trust me, people listen when I talk." The diner was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Robert swallowed so hard Keisha could hear it. He looked around, realizing there was no way out of this. His reputation, his business, everything was now on the line. His shoulders slumped. She can stay." Trump smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what I thought." Robert turned toward Keisha, his face pale, his pride clearly bruised. "You still want your job?" Keisha didn't even hesitate. She took off her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. "No, Robert," she said, "I don't." She turned to Trump, holding his gaze. "Thank you." Trump nodded, like he respected the choice. Then, casually, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small business card, sliding it across the table toward her. "I own a lot of hotels, restaurants, places that actually value hard workers." He smirked. "Call that number if you ever want a job where you'll be treated with respect." Keisha hesitated for only a moment before picking up the card. It was heavy, real, and it had his personal contact line printed on it. She glanced at Robert one last time, then looked around the diner at the people still staring in shock. Then she smiled and walked out the door. As Keisha stepped out into the cool night air, she could still feel the weight of the business card in her hand. Her fingers traced over the embossed lettering, gold, sharp, important. The name Donald J. Trump stood out in bold, along with a direct number beneath it. The realization of what had just happened settled over her like a wave. She had walked away from 5 years of her life at Jackson's Diner, from every late-night shift, every regular who knew her name, every memory she had made there. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small, she didn't feel trapped, she felt free. Inside the diner, people were still murmuring, whispering about what had just gone down. Robert Whitmore, red-faced and humiliated, had disappeared into his office. The staff stood frozen behind the counter, unsure of what to do next. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. At the booth near the window, Trump took a sip of his Diet Coke, his gaze casually flicking over to the door where Keisha had just exited. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered to no one in particular. One of the Secret Service agents standing beside him, a tall man with a square jaw and sharp eyes, leaned in slightly. "Should we follow her, sir?" Trump waved him off. No, she'll figure it out." He tapped the edge of his glass with one finger. "She's smart, she's tough, she'll call." The agent nodded and stepped back, hands clasped in front of him, scanning the room once more. Across the diner, some people had started to shift in their seats. An older man in a plaid shirt, a regular who had been coming to Jackson's diner for years, slowly shook his head. "Never seen anything like that before," he murmured to the woman sitting across from him. A younger couple at the counter, both in their 20s, exchanged a glance. The man, dark-haired with a 5 o'clock shadow, leaned in and whispered, "Did that really just happen?" His girlfriend, still gripping her coffee mug with both hands, nodded slowly. "Yeah," and he stood up for her. It wasn't what people had expected. Trump was used to controversy, used to making headlines, but no one had predicted that he would step in and defend the black waitress who had just been fired before his eyes. And yet, there it was. Robert, still rattled from the encounter, stormed into the back room. His hands were shaking as he reached for the bottle of whiskey he kept in his office drawer. He poured himself a glass, downed it in one gulp, and then slammed the empty glass down on his desk. How had this happened? How had everything spun so wildly out of control? He had been running this diner for 20 years, and no one, not a single person, had ever questioned how he ran things. He was the boss. He made the rules. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, the President of the United States had walked in, flipped the entire situation on its head, and humiliated him in front of his entire restaurant. Robert gritted his teeth, gripping the edge of his desk. He had lost control of the narrative, and worst of all, the staff knew it. Back in the kitchen, Michael, the young white waiter who Robert had intended to serve Trump, was still standing in the doorway, watching the aftermath unfold. He hadn't said a word through the entire ordeal. He didn't need to. The truth was already clear. Everyone in the diner had seen what had happened. Everyone had heard it. And from the way the staff exchanged looks, from the way the customers whispered amongst themselves, Robert knew that this moment wouldn't just disappear. It would spread. People would talk. And if there was one thing Robert hated, it was not being in control of the conversation. But outside, Keisha didn't care about any of that. She stood on the sidewalk, inhaling deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about her next shift, about clocking in on time, about smiling through the rude customers or pretending she didn't notice Robert's favoritism. She was done. But what now? Her fingers brushed against the business card again. Should she really call? It was one thing for Trump to hand her the card in a moment of frustration, but did he really mean it? Did he truly expect her to reach out? Or had it just been for show? Her pride made her hesitate. She had worked her ass off for years, never once asking for a handout. And now, after everything, would she really be calling the president for a job? Keisha shook her head. Maybe she needed time to think. Maybe she needed to process. She glanced up, taking in the street around her. The neon glow from the diner's sign flickered in the reflection of the pavement, the muffled sound of conversation still seeping through the windows. Then, suddenly, the door swung open behind her. She turned, half expecting Robert to come storming out, ready to argue some more. But it wasn't Robert. It was one of the regulars, an older black woman, maybe in her 60s, with graying hair tucked under a warm wool hat. Keisha had served her plenty of times before. Miss Geraldine. Miss Geraldine stepped out, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She gave Keisha a long, thoughtful look, then smiled. "You handled yourself well in there, baby," she said. Keisha let out a small breath. "Thanks." Miss Geraldine nodded toward the card in Keisha's hand. "You gonna call?" Keisha exhaled, looking down at the business card again. She ran her thumb over the edges, considering. "I don't know yet," she admitted. Miss Geraldine tilted her head, studying her. "Let me tell you something," she said softly. "The world's full of people who will try to put you in a box, tell you where you belong, tell you what you can and can't do." She reached out, gently tapping Keisha's hand right over the card. But when someone with real power looks at you and says, "I see something in you," you don't ignore that. Keisha swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Miss Geraldine smiled knowingly. "You go on home, baby. Get some rest." Then, with a final nod, she walked down the sidewalk and disappeared into the night. Keisha stood there for a long moment, staring down at the card again. Maybe Miss Geraldine was right. Maybe this was more than just a job offer. Maybe it was a door, one she had never imagined would open for her. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and then slid the card carefully into her pocket. Tomorrow, she would decide. But for the first time in years, Keisha knew one thing for sure. She was never stepping foot in Jackson's diner again. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Keisha's tiny apartment, casting golden streaks across the floor. She had barely slept. The business card sat on her nightstand, untouched since she got home. She had picked it up at least a dozen times, turning it over in her fingers, reading the number, whispering it under her breath as if speaking it aloud would make the decision easier. She had fought for everything in her life. Nothing had ever been handed to her, and she had never expected it to be. That was what made this so hard. This opportunity, if it was even real, had landed in her lap after one moment of standing up for herself. Was that how the world worked? Or was this just some fluke, some bizarre twist of fate? The idea of working for Trump was complicated. People had a lot of opinions about him, and so did she. But last night, he had stood up for her. He had called out Robert's racism when most people would have ignored it. And that meant something. Keisha sat up, rubbing her face. The clock read 9:42 a.m. If she was still working at the diner, she'd already be halfway through her morning shift, dealing with coffee refills and grumpy regulars. Instead, she was sitting here, jobless, staring at a piece of cardstock that could change her life. Before she could overthink it again, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number. 1 ring, 2, 3, then a voice. "Hello?" It wasn't a secretary, it wasn't an assistant, it was him. Keisha's breath hitched. "Mr. President." A slight pause, then, "Knew you'd call." She blinked. "You did?" Trump chuckled. "Of course, you've got a good head on your shoulders. Smart people don't walk away from opportunities." Keisha hesitated, glancing around her apartment. She had expected a middleman, a formal process. Not this. She exhaled. "I don't know if this is real. If this is... I don't know. A test?" Trump laughed. "A test? No, I don't have time for games. I saw someone who deserves better, and I don't like seeing good people get treated like garbage. That's bad business. Simple as that." Keisha bit her lip. "And what exactly are you offering?" Another pause, then, "Tell me this. You work hard, right? Always. You know how to handle people?" "I've been waitressing for 5 years. I could run a whole restaurant by myself if I had to." "That's what I thought." He seemed to consider something for a moment. "I own a lot of hotels. Big, beautiful hotels. Best in the world, really. And a lot of them have restaurants, lounges, some of the finest dining establishments in the country." Keisha sat up straighter. "You interested in management?" he asked. Her heart skipped. "Management?" "That's right. I don't hand out pity jobs, Keisha. I'm offering you something real. A leadership position, good salary, benefits, the whole deal. You deserve it." Keisha swallowed. "Why me?" Trump's voice was firm. "Because I saw something in you. Because I know talent when I see it. And because, unlike some people, I reward hard work." She was silent for a moment. Then, finally, she said, "Where?" Trump grinned through the phone. She could hear it in his voice. "I've got a place in D.C. Beautiful hotel. Historic. We could start you there." Keisha's mind raced. Washington, D.C., a whole new city, a new start. A real job, not just a job, a career. She took a deep breath. When do I start? The flight to DC was smoother than she expected. First class, courtesy of her new employer. It still didn't feel real. When she landed, a car was waiting for her. A sleek black SUV driven by a man in a crisp suit who greeted her by name. "Welcome to DC, Ms. Brown," he said as he opened the door for her. Ms. Brown. That felt different. As they drove through the city, Keisha took in the sights. The Capitol, the Washington Monument, the historic buildings that lined the streets. She was no longer just a waitress at a small-town diner. She was stepping into something bigger. The SUV pulled up in front of the Trump International Hotel, its grand architecture gleaming in the morning light. The moment she stepped inside, she knew. This was nothing like Jackson's diner. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the impeccably dressed staff. This was a world she had never set foot in before. And now it was her new workplace. A man in a tailored suit approached, smiling warmly. "Ms. Brown, welcome. We've been expecting you." She straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that she had earned this. Trump had been right about one thing. She had the skills. She knew how to deal with people, how to manage chaos, how to run a tight ship. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, she was a leader. As she was led to her office, an actual office, she let out a slow breath, taking it all in. She had stood up for herself, she had refused to be disrespected, and because of that, her entire life had changed. She thought about Robert, about Jackson's diner, about how, for years, she had let herself believe that was all she would ever have. Never again. That night, as she sat in her new apartment overlooking the city, her phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was simple. "Proud of you. You made the right call. DJT." Keisha smiled. Yeah, she had.